G'day. Welcome back to the channel. And if this is your very first time here, you are more than welcome. If it is so, please make sure you hit that subscribe button, click the bell for notifications, and like any video that you see. I was born in 1970. Pretty much all of you know that. I grew up in the era of Margaret Thatcher, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Ronald Reagan. I have always appreciated his tenacity and his no-nonsense approach to the Cold War. Ronald Reagan was born in February of 1911. That was over a full year before the Titanic sank. He became a sports commentator after being quite a successful sportsman himself. Then he went into the movies, and then he went into politics, as he had always had kind of a affliction, shall we say, with politics. His political agenda led him eventually to become the governor of California in 1966. In 1980, Ronald Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter to become what is now known as the oldest president of the United States of America, only to be beaten by Donald Trump. During his presidency, Reagan formed a very strong alliance with Margaret Thatcher and sort of with Gorbachev. After many years of discussions, they eventually signed a treaty that basically ended the Cold War. Just before the end of his second term, Reagan made a speech, and it is probably best known as "Tear Down These Walls." It was basically aimed at Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. And in 1989, just a few months after leaving office, the wall was torn down. However, Reagan had a very, very funny side. I've put together a few clips of his humour. It's more than likely going to get copyrighted, but I don't give a monkeys, because that guy back then was funny. Please enjoy.
The story was an American and a Russian arguing about their two countries, and the American said, "Look, in my country, I can walk into the Oval Office, I can pound the president's desk and say, 'Mr. President, I don't like the way you're running our country.'" And the Russian said, "I can do that." The American said, "You can?" He says, "Yes. I can go into the Kremlin, to the General Secretary's office, pound his desk and say, 'Mr. General Secretary, I don't like the way President Reagan's running his country.'"
Today marks my first State of the Union address to you, a constitutional duty as old as our republic itself. President Washington began this tradition in 1790 after reminding the nation that the destiny of self-government and the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty is finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. For our friends in the press who place a high premium on accuracy, let me say, I did not actually hear George Washington say that.
This
is Frank Sinatra's night, and I'm here out of gratitude. Frank worked for me in all my campaigns. He was with me all the way to the governor's mansion. Without his help, who knows? I might have been president. You know, there's a 10-year delay in the Soviet Union of delivery of an automobile. And only 1 out of 7 families in the Soviet Union own automobiles. There's a 10-year wait. And you go through quite a process when you're ready to buy, and then you put up the money in advance. And this happened to a fella, and this is their story that they tell, this joke. That this man, he laid down his money, and then the fella that was in charge said to him, okay, come back in 10 years and get your car. And he said, morning or afternoon? And the fellow behind the counter said, well, 10 years from now, what difference does it make? And he said, well, the plumber's coming in the morning. It was about a fella that was driving down a country road, and all of a sudden I looked out, and there beside him was a chicken. He was doing about 45, and the chicken was running alongside. So he stepped on the gas, he got it up to about 60, and the chicken caught up with him and was right beside him again. And then he thought, as he was looking at him, that the chicken had 3 legs. But before he could really make up his mind for sure, the chicken took off out in front of him at 60 miles an hour, turned down a lane into a barnyard. Well, he made a quick turn and went down into the barnyard too, and there was a farmer standing there. And he asked him, he said, did a chicken come past you? And he said, yeah. Well, he said, am I crazy, or did the chicken have 3 legs? And he says, yep. It's mine. He says, I breed 3-legged chickens. And the fellow said, for heaven's sakes, why? Well, he says, I like the drumstick, Ma likes the drumstick, and now the kid likes the drumstick, and we just got tired of fighting for him. And the driver said, well, how does it taste? He says, I don't know. I've never been able to catch one. Now, there's nothing I enjoy more than a little country humor. One of the great things about having you here is that I get to tell a farm joke. Now, first I need a setting, but Rick, you're from Kansas, right?
You bet.
Okay, this takes place in Kansas. It was an old Kansas farmer there. He had a piece of creek bottom land that had never been developed at all. It was all rocks and brush and all messed up, and he started in on it, clearing it, the underbrush, and hauling away the rocks, then cultivating the soil there, and he planted a garden, everything from vegetables on to corn, and it really became a garden spot, and he was pretty proud of what he'd done. So one Sunday morning in church after the service, he asked the preacher if he wouldn't stop by to have a look. Well, the preacher arrived, and he took one look, and he said, oh, this is wonderful. He said, these are the biggest tomatoes I've ever seen. Praise the Lord. He said, those green beans, that squash, those melons. He said, the Lord really has blessed this place. And look at the height of that corn. He said, the God has really been good. And the old boy was listening to all this, and he was getting more and more fidgety, and finally he blurted out, Reverend, I wish you could have seen it when the Lord was doing it by himself. Less than 1 family out of 7 in the Soviet Union owns an automobile. Most of the automobiles are driven by the bureaucrats. The government furnishes them and drivers and so forth. So an order went out one day to the police that anyone caught speeding, anyone, no matter who, gets a ticket. Well, Gorbachev came out of his country home, his dacha. He was late getting to the Kremlin. There was his limousine and driver waiting. He told the driver to get in the back seat, he'd drive, and down the road he went. They passed 2 motorcycle cops. One took out after him. And pretty soon he's back with his buddy, and his buddy says, well, did you give him a ticket? And he said, no. Well, he said, why not? Oh, he says, too important. Well, he said, we're told to give anybody a ticket, no matter who it is. Oh, he said, no, this one was, I could. Well, he said, who was it? He said, I couldn't recognize him. But his driver was Gorbachev. There aren't any words that can properly tell you how bittersweet these days are, and the things that we would like to say to all of you. You know, I keep remembering back, and not too far, when someplace along the line there would always be a picture of a president standing in the Oval Office, looking out the window, usually the picture from behind, and he's standing there, and then his words are quoted as a tag for that picture about, this is the loneliest place, and what a lonely, and so forth. I don't know about them. I haven't been lonely 1 minute.
It's my considered opinion that the two gentlemen who flank me would make quite a political ticket. Frank as president, Dean as his crawling mate.
About the man walking along the street at night, Moscow, Soviet soldier called to him to halt. He started to run, the soldier shot him. And another man said, "Why did you do that?" Well, he said, "Curfew." Well, he said, "It isn't curfew yet." He said, "I know. He's a friend of mine. I know where he lives. He couldn't have made it."
You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience. This convention brings back so many memories to a fellow like me. I can still remember my first Republican convention, Abraham Lincoln giving a speech that sent tingles down my spine. No, I have to confess I wasn't actually there. The truth is, way back then, I belonged to the other party. Which makes me think of a story. Everything makes me think of a story. About 3 dogs, an American dog and a Polish dog and a Russian dog. They were all having a visit, and the American dog was telling them about how things were in this country. He said, you know, you bark, and you bark long enough, and then somebody comes along and gives you some meat. And the Polish dog said, "What's meat?" The Russian dog says, "What's bark?" There's a story, and I understand it's true. It's about a newspaper photographer out in Los Angeles. Kind of reminds me of Howard. He was called in by his editor and told of a fire that was raging in Palos Verdes. That's a hilly area in the southern part of Los Angeles County. And the photographer's assignment was to rush down to a small local airport, board a waiting plane, go out and get some pictures of the fire, and be back in time for the afternoon edition. Well, he raced down the freeway, broke all the traffic laws, got to the airport, drove his car to the end of the runway, and sure enough, there was a plane revving up its engines, ready to go. He jumped in the plane shouting, "Let's go," and they were off. At about 5,000 feet, he began getting his camera out of the bag, told the fellow flying the plane to get him over the fire so he could get his pictures and get back to the paper. And from the other side of the cockpit, there was a deafening silence. And then he heard those words he will always remember. "Aren't you the instructor?"
Ronald Reagan, or Dutch as he was better known, named by his father due to his fat little Dutch boy appearance because of his haircut, died in June 2004. He will and is sadly missed by millions of people around the world. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Like I said earlier, if you are new here, please subscribe, click subscribe and the bell, and share it with your friends, your family, your enemies, but also remember to keep that 1.5 meter distance between you when you share. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Good day.